Centuries of secrets, crowns won, lost and buried, sometimes literally. But what if the mysteries that haunted England's monarchy for generations weren't just unsolved? They were recently cracked wide open. From hidden palaces to coded letters, sunken ships to silent bones, these aren't fairy tales, they're royal truths, unearthed. This isn't about what you learned in history class. This is about what they just found. This is 25 English royal mysteries that only just got solved, and no one's rewriting the textbooks. Yet. Before we dive headfirst into royal intrigue, hit that subscribe button if you're into history that still has dirt under its fingernails. We've got 25 mysteries to uncover, and trust me, you'll want front row access for what's coming next. While you're here, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Let's see just how far this mystery network really stretches. 1. Princes in the Tower. Smoking gun duel. It began with a chain, not a metaphorical one, though of course that too, but a literal one, a delicate jewel-inlaid link of gold traced back to the 15th century. At first glance, it looked like any other noble heirloom lost to time and auction houses, its provenance foggy, its wear smooth. But this wasn't just any trinket. This chain bore a lineage, unbroken, unburnished, connecting it directly to Edward V, the elder of the two lost princes in the Tower. And suddenly, centuries of speculation grew teeth. In 2023, a historian poring through a minor aristocrat's will, a document dusty from disuse and largely forgotten by everyone but the most masochistic of Tudor archivists, discovered a passing reference to the chain of the young king. The young king. Not prince, not boy, king. The term was used casually, almost like a family story everyone assumed was just half true, but the chain itself still existed, miraculously preserved in a private collection, handed down like a family joke no one quite understood. That's the British aristocracy for you. Generations of eccentrics hoarding priceless relics behind drapes and dogs. A forensic study of the piece traced its materials and craftsmanship to the late 15th century, matching known regalia of Edward V's brief and almost mythical reign. Then came the name Sir James Tyrrell. Yes, that Tyrrell, allegedly the man who, under the whispered orders of Richard III, smothered the two princes in the Tower of London sometime in 1483. The same Tyrrell whose confession, extracted under Henry VII's reign, had always reeked of political convenience. A scapegoat dressed up in royal ink. But here was a connection, solid, material, and disturbingly elegant. The chain had passed from Edward V into the possession of a family whose papers linked them to Tyrrell, a bloodline of silence. It was never supposed to survive. History tried to burn it, bury it, forget it. But it lived in a drawer, inheritance as accident, a fragment of murder wrapped in velvet. For decades, perhaps centuries, the debate had been theological. Were the boys dead? If so, who killed them? Did Richard III act alone, or at all? Were they spirited away to Flanders? To Yorkshire? Were they even boys when they died? The kind of ambiguity that fed entire publishing industries, Tudor conspiracy theorists, and a cottage economy of tour guides winking beside the Tower Green. But now, a chain, not a confession, not a theory. Something you could touch, something heavy. Suddenly, the murder theory wasn't just plausible, it had a scent. One that reeked of guilt passed down like family silver. Naturally, the find stirred the usual chorus. Revisionists cried foul, Ricardians clutched at technicalities, and academic skeptics reminded everyone that artifacts alone do not history make. But in the court of collective imagination, the trial had turned. The ghost of Edward V, forever suspended in adolescent limbo, seemed to lean forward, closer now, not quite at peace, but almost visible. Was this the final word? No, but it was a new sentence in a chapter everyone thought had ended with ellipses. And in its glint, you could almost see a locked door opening, just wide enough for other things to crawl through. Because once you start following jewelry to murderers, bones aren't far behind. And right on cue, they were next. 2. Princes in the Tower. Push for DNA tests. They've been lying under a slab in Westminster Abbey since 1674, tucked inside an urn behind iron grills under a plaque that calls them simply the remains of the 2 princes. No names, no confirmation, just 2 small skeletons found by accident during renovations beneath a staircase in the Tower of London. The bones were promptly claimed by Charles II and reburied with royal ceremony, as if that would make the problem go away. But here's the thing, bones don't go away, they wait. And now, after nearly 350 years, they've started to make noise again, without uttering a word. In the wake of the chain discovery, the smoking gun that linked Edward V to Sir James Tyrrell's orbit, historians, archaeologists and forensic genealogists did what they do best. They circled, they revisited old assumptions, they dusted off proposals long buried in polite academic silence. Chief among them, the idea of exhuming the urn, extracting DNA, and solving, finally, whether these remains belonged to Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. At the centre of this renewed push is a growing chorus of experts who argue that the technology has finally caught up with the mystery. We now have usable DNA from known royal remains, such as Richard III's, confirmed in 2012 via mitochondrial analysis. His distant relatives were identified, matched and cross-checked. A model forensic case, so why not apply the same methods to the princes? The answer, it turns out, is both simple and absurdly complicated, because nobody wants to be the one who opens the box. Westminster Abbey is a religious site, not a crime lab, and the Church of England, which holds the decision-making power, has consistently refused to allow the remains to be tested on the grounds of respect, sanctity, and the potential for controversy. It's a strange stance, considering how many royal tombs have been rifled through for far less pressing reasons, such as figuring out whether Henry VIII was actually fat or just wide. The irony is brutal. For centuries, the supposed murder of these 2 boys has been one of the darkest stains on royal history. But when the tools finally emerge to verify whether these are even the right boys, the conversation shuts down, as if answering the question might make things worse. Yet the pressure is mounting. A 2024 roundtable of royal historians held quietly behind Abbey walls revealed growing divisions among experts. Some argue the issue has shifted from historical curiosity to moral imperative. After all, if these remains are indeed the princes, the least we can do, after centuries of theorizing, politicizing, and building careers on their disappearance, is give them names. And if they're not, then we've been venerating the wrong children, and 2 others are lying lost, misremembered by history. Public opinion, meanwhile, is restless. The success of the Richard III project proved that science and storytelling can coexist and even thrive in the same grave. And documentaries, podcasts and books have kept the prince's plight unnervingly fresh. People want closure, or, more precisely, they want the illusion of closure, just enough certainty to satisfy, but not enough to banish the mystery entirely. But still, the urn remains sealed. Perhaps the hesitation lies deeper. Perhaps we suspect that confirming the bones would end the wrong part of the story. That if we find the boys, we might have to finally accept what was done to them. That the romance of the unknown would collapse into something clinical, quantified and sterile. A database match, not a ghost. So the debate rages quietly, between laboratories and liturgy, between data and dignity. The princes remain where they've always been, caught between 2 worlds, symbol and evidence, tragedy and theory. Their story, once hushed by stone, is now loud in silence. And then, just as the scientific camp rallied for a breakthrough, something entirely unscientific arrived to challenge the momentum. a voice from the margins of consensus, bearing a radical claim. Because, according to one new theory, the princes weren't killed at all. If your brain's already buzzing with questions, and we've only just started, you're in the right place. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this royal unraveling. And while the princes stay silent, tell us your story. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Let's see who else is down this rabbit hole with us. 3. Princes in the Tower. Case solved counter theory. Just when historians thought the mystery was narrowing toward closure, bones in an urn, DNA on standby, murder weapon glinting under curatorial lights, along came Philippa Langley again. You might remember Langley as the screenwriter turned historian who spearheaded the 2012 discovery of Richard III's skeleton beneath a Leicester parking lot, a modern legend in the world of royal mysteries. Not a credentialed academic, no, something far more dangerous, persistent. So when she returned in 2023 with a new project, The Missing Princes, people paid attention, even if reluctantly. The title alone was bold. Not the lost princes, not the murdered princes. Missing, as in not dead. Langley's project, part book, part documentary, and part slow-burn detective thriller, argued that both Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury didn't die in the Tower at all. According to her multi-year investigation across archives, letters, regional records, and one especially interesting priest's journal, the boys survived the summer of 1483 and went into hiding under assumed identities, separately. The theory goes like this. After their uncle, Richard III, took the throne, the princes were quietly moved out of the Tower, not murdered, but disappeared. Langley's team points to obscure but persistent records of two boys under royal protection cropping up in Europe in the late 1480s. She suggests one prince may have ended up in Devon under the name John Evans, the other in Belgium, cloaked in ecclesiastical service. Neither reclaimed the throne, but both supposedly lived out full shadowed lives. If that sounds like historical fan fiction, you're not alone in thinking so. Most academic historians rolled their eyes so hard they nearly dislocated something, and yet Langley brought receipts, maybe not smoking guns, but certainly warm leads. A letter here, a recorded alias there, a hint of payments from suspicious accounts in the royal ledger books. Enough not to dismiss outright, and most disturbingly for the establishment, enough to explain why those Westminster bones might not actually belong to the princes. That's the part that sticks, because for all the push toward DNA testing, Langley's theory reframes the question. If the bones aren't the boys, testing them won't solve anything. It'll just clarify what they aren't. And if the boys lived, the entire premise of the murder mystery collapses, not into closure, but into bureaucratic failure. The Tower didn't kill them. It simply lost them. Of course, the theory has its problems. For one, it rests heavily on circumstantial evidence. There's no photograph, no signed confession, no definitive body. Langley's argument is a tapestry of inference, stitched from scraps. But then again, so is most of Tudor historiography. Richard III. Third apologists, long accused of wishful revisionism, now cite her work as a kind of posthumous exoneration. Richard didn't kill his nephews, they say. He protected them, gave them new names, hid them from danger, but if so, why hide them forever? Here's where Langley's counter-theory opens more doors than it closes. If the boys were alive, they were still dangerous. Royal blood with a claim to the throne, even under aliases. Maybe they were moved again. Maybe someone else, Tudor perhaps, finished what Richard supposedly didn't. Or maybe the boys, grown into cautious, anonymous men, chose silence over civil war. Either way, the neat tragedy of the princes becomes messy survival, a new kind of haunting. Less martyrdom, more exile, and for the public, something far stranger happens. We're forced to imagine the boys aging, not frozen in youthful innocence, but walking in the world, shaped by the trauma of erasure. The mystery doesn't die, it multiplies. Now there's a life to reconstruct. Two, even. And a new question emerges. Is it better to die a mystery or live as one? Philippa Langley's theory may never convince the majority, but it doesn't have to. It just has to linger, and right now it does. Her investigation sits like a chess piece moved late in the game, awkward, inconvenient, and hard to ignore. But in the swirl of theories and counter-theories, there's one thing no one saw coming. That the next voice to speak across time wouldn't be from bones or jewels or unsigned letters. It would come from ink and cipher, a queen writing in code. 4. Mary, Queen of Scots, lost cipher letters, 57 of them, decoded 2023. For centuries, Mary, Queen of Scots, has existed in the collective imagination as both victim and villain, saint in a storm, or schemer with a rosary. Her letters, her liaisons, her lingering perfume in the corridors of power, all of it scrutinized, fictionalized, and weaponized across centuries of biography and propaganda. But even with all the ink spilled in her name, one mystery remained oddly intact. 57 letters written in a code so dense and idiosyncratic that even seasoned cryptographers had thrown up their hands. Until 2023. The breakthrough came not from a musty vault or secret drawer, but from the digital wilderness of an online archive. A group of international codebreakers, equal parts linguists, computer scientists, and passionate amateurs, were pouring through the Bibliothèque Nationale de France's digital manuscript collection. The files had been miscatalogued, believed to be Italian diplomatic correspondence, but one cipher caught their attention. Complex, repetitive, oddly structured, the kind of code that carries desperation. They cracked it gradually, letter by letter, symbol by symbol, a secret language built on fear, crafted under surveillance, and meant to preserve the inner voice of a queen stripped of everything but her ability to write. The letters were from Mary, Queen of Scots, written during her long captivity in England, between 1578 and 1584, when she was being held by Elizabeth I. Most scholars believed we had already seen the worst of it, the famous Babington plot letter used as the smoking gun to convict her of treason. But these newly deciphered letters predate that, revealing a deeper, more textured portrait of the woman behind the myth. This wasn't the Mary we'd seen embroidered into melodrama. This was Mary, the strategist, Mary, the exhausted prisoner, Mary, the mother terrified for her son, James, Mary negotiating with foreign allies, Mary watching the walls close in and trying to pry them open with words. She writes to Michel de Castelnau, the French ambassador in London, in tight, eloquent phrases, her signature style buried beneath numeric symbols and Baroque encryption. The tone is not melodramatic, not overwrought, but surgical, controlled, desperate, yes, but dignified. She speaks of betrayal, of sickness, of faith, of the unbearable uncertainty of exile. She plots alliances. She pleads for intervention. She watches from the shadows, attempting to reach across the channel, across power structures, across time. The letters change what we thought we knew. Before this, Mary's captivity was seen as largely passive, a slow-motion decline into martyrdom. But here, in her own hidden hand, she's active, reaching, reshaping narratives in real time. The coded letters confirm that she was more politically aware and diplomatically engaged than many historians gave her credit for. They reveal her maneuvering, her efforts to remain central to European power politics, even while physically removed from the board, and they reframe the tragedy. Because if Mary was this sharp, this aware, this involved, then her downfall wasn't merely the product of Tudor cruelty or unfortunate romance, it was strategic elimination. She wasn't merely a threat, She was playing the game. Of course, the decoding has reopened old wounds. Some accuse modern scholars of glamorizing espionage. Others argue that the cipher letters, while fascinating, don't absolve Mary from the charges that eventually led to her execution. And they don't, but that was never the point. The real power of these letters isn't exoneration, it's rehumanization. They give back to Mary what history so often withholds from women. It turns into symbols, interiority, complexity, the right to be both flawed and brilliant, tragic and calculating. For code breakers, it's the kind of win that only comes once in a generation. For historians, it's a reminder that archives still breathe, that digital files mislabeled by centuries can suddenly swing open a trapdoor into a forgotten reality. And for everyone else, for us, it's something more unsettling. Because if 57 secret letters from one of the most surveilled women in history could remain hidden in plain sight for 400 years, what else is still out there? What else lies buried in misfiled folders and mislabeled memory? As it turns out, the next royal secret wasn't buried in code, but underwater, cold, intact, and carrying a king. 5. The Gloucester 1682 wreck located and studied public in 2022. When the Gloucester set sail in May of 1682, it carried more than men. It carried a future king. James, Duke of York, soon to be James II, was on board, fresh off exile, returning to reclaim proximity to the throne after the political fog of the Restoration. It should have been a routine voyage, albeit one draped in pomp and politics. Instead, it became a nautical near-catastrophe, a moment so pivotal and yet so strangely undertold that it barely echoes in the national memory. Until 2022, that is, when the Gloucester was found. She had been resting, intact, preserved, forgotten, somewhere off the Norfolk coast, beneath layers of sand, silence, and centuries of myth. For decades, maritime archaeologists and amateur divers had hunted the wreck with only vague coordinates and contradictory naval logs to guide them. The Gloucester had supposedly gone down after striking a sandbank somewhere north of Great Yarmouth. But the sea doesn't give up its secrets easily, and the exact location remained unknown. Then, after years of search and luck, the Barnwell brothers, two Norfolk divers operating with the precision of hobbyists turned obsessives, located the wreck. It had taken them 15 years. What they found wasn't just a royal shipwreck, it was a time capsule. The Gloucester went down fast, too fast for protocol, too fast for dignity. Some 130 to 250 souls are believed to have drowned, though the future king survived. In fact, James delayed abandoning ship so long, insisting on the proper ceremonial evacuation of royalty, that many of his fellow passengers perished needlessly. A fact that even then caused scandal, a fact that in light of the discovery looks worse, because now we can see the wreck, not just in theory, not as a footnote, but in salt-stained timber and surviving artifacts, shoes, bottles, navigation tools, even personal effects. The condition of the ship stunned researchers. It was remarkably well preserved, its hull and layout offering rare insights into 17th century naval design, and more importantly, into the statecraft of royal travel. The discovery answered long-standing questions about the Gloucester's route, the exact cause of the wreck, and the moments leading up to disaster. Marine archaeologists confirmed that the ship did not go down due to simple bad luck or weather. It was poor navigation and failure to heed warnings. Tides, charts, human arrogance. There's poetry in that. A royal ship goes down, not because of some grand act of God, but because someone ignored advice. The monarchy reduced to maritime mismanagement. But the real twist lies in what didn't sink with the ship: James. His survival changed everything. Had he drowned, the line of succession would have fractured. The Glorious Revolution, arguably the most significant reshuffling of power in English history, might never have happened. William and Mary, delayed or derailed. The Constitutional monarchy, perhaps stillborn. The entire modern British political order hinges, in part, on the fact that James made it off the Gloucester alive, which makes the wreck not just archaeological treasure, but geopolitical pivot point. A reminder that history turns not on inevitability, but on buoyancy and timing. Since the announcement in 2022, the Gloucester has become a focal point of scholarly attention. Museum exhibitions are underway, conservation work is painstaking, and the narrative is slowly expanding. A ship that was once a marginal footnote now stands as a floating metaphor for power, fragility, and royal delay. Naturally, conspiracy has crept in. Some claim the ship was sabotaged, others believe sensitive documents were on board. Plans, letters, political secrets, now lost forever. But most of those ideas dissolve under scrutiny. The truth, as usual, is murkier and more inconvenient. The shipwreck was a preventable disaster, which of course makes it feel incredibly modern. And so another royal silence collapses under the weight of its own timbers. Another unsolvable royal incident washed clean by brine and sonar. The Gloucester is now no longer missing. It is found, catalogued, known, but finding a wreck is only the first step. Understanding what it meant, what it really changed, that takes time, and in England, the coastline isn't the only place that swallows royal history. Sometimes it's the ground beneath your feet, the earth of East Anglia, where a field once whispered of kings, and in 2024 it finally spoke. 6. Rendlesham Royal Palace mapped. For decades it was little more than a name in Bede's ecclesiastical history, paired with an air of suspicion and a sense of something missing. Rendlesham, mentioned in passing as a place of kings, sat in the scholarly imagination like a puzzle with too many blank tiles. The Anglo-Saxon site was real, yes. The land had been walked, scanned, theorized about, but the exact nature of its importance, that remained speculative. A possible royal hall, a ceremonial site, a palace, perhaps, if you squinted hard enough. And then, in 2024, the ground gave up its story. What was once just hypothetical, the elusive seat of East Anglian kings, has now been painstakingly mapped, trench by trench, layer by layer. The result is not only the confirmation of a royal settlement at Rendlesham, but the unearthing of a 1,400-year-old temple complex that sat at its spiritual core. Not just halls and feasting platforms, but sacred space. Purposeful, designed, crowned in ritual. In the language of archaeological understatement, this is what they call a major find. In real terms, it's a revelation. Because for centuries, Anglo-Saxon royal power has hovered somewhere between legend and footnote. We had Sutton Hoo, the ship burial, the helmet, the gold, but no clear idea where that kind of wealth and authority lived, where it ruled. Sutton Hoo was a grave. Rendlesham, it turns out, was where life and rule actually happened. The new mapping project, led by the Sutton Hoo Landscape Project and University College London, used ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, and good old-fashioned boots in the soil. What they revealed was not just a structure or two, but a complex of interlocking precincts, halls, enclosures, and the centerpiece, the long-lost royal temple. This wasn't a random countryside outpost. This was engineered authority. Symbolic power written into the landscape. The temple itself, rare to find at all from this period, is a smoking altar in the study of early English kingship. Not just governance, but ideology. Worship and rule fused. Even more telling was the layout. The sacred precinct was deliberately segregated from the royal hall and residential zones. This was not casual paganism. It was organized, hierarchical, probably terrifying in its theatricality, and precisely the kind of thing that would rattle later Christian chroniclers, hence the evasive way Bede references it, as if invoking something dangerous best left unsaid. With the temple discovery came more detail, artisanal metalwork, high-status jewelry, imported goods. ceremonial blades, items that spoke not just of wealth but of reach. This wasn't a provincial king living in a wooden hut. This was a node in a network, connected to continental elites, trading with empires, receiving guests who arrived with silver and left with stories. More tantalizing still is the overlap with Sutton Hoo. The ship burial lies just a few miles away. For decades, scholars suspected the two sites were linked. Now, with Rendlesham confirmed as a royal seat, the burial begins to make more sense. Sutton Hoo was the curtain call. Rendlesham was the performance. Of course, this doesn't tie up the story neatly. If anything, it raises more questions. What rituals took place in the temple? Were they local or imported? What beliefs did they reflect? Did those practices shape the Christian conversion narratives that followed, or were they deliberately erased by them? There's a deeper tension at play here, the collision between the physical and the remembered. Sutton Hoo gave us objects without context. Rendlesham is giving us the context, but that context doesn't confirm the sanitized version of early English kingship. It suggests a darker, more dramatic beginning. A world where kings were priests, rituals were strategic, and the line between crown and cult was razor thin. And so, what started as a marginal reference in a medieval manuscript has become a central node in our understanding of pre-Christian England. The palace is no longer invisible. The temple is no longer theoretical. The story is no longer myth. But if Rendlesham was the stage, what was the kingdom? What were its boundaries? And who exactly ruled its rituals? To answer that, archaeologists turned outward, because the fields weren't finished speaking. Just beyond the temple walls, a wider world was starting to take shape, mapped, measured, and traced in soil. The settlement of kings was bigger than anyone guessed. 7. Rendlesham, wider royal settlement. It's always tempting to draw a line around a discovery, to label the temple the climax, the palace the star, the find as the moment. But history rarely cooperates with that kind of narrative neatness. As with Rendlesham, the headline about the royal palace and its 1,400-year-old temple wasn't an ending. It was just the surface ripple of something larger moving underneath. Because what 2021 to 2023's broader excavations revealed is that Rendlesham wasn't a single royal site. It was a royal ecosystem. Using extensive geophysical surveys, field walking, soil analysis, and small-scale excavations, archaeologists began to sketch out what is now understood to be an elite Anglo-Saxon landscape complex, an expansive, highly organized settlement of halls, precincts, boundary zones, agricultural areas, artisanal production, and formalized burial grounds. It was not a courtly island dropped into a random field. It was a deliberately constructed hub of regional authority. In modern terms, think of it as the Downing Street of its age, except with cows, cremation mounds, and gold leaf pendants. The settlement sprawled across at least 120 hectares, enormous by early medieval standards, and its scale shifts how we think about kingship in early England. The kings of East Anglia weren't operating from fortified hilltops or ragtag longhouses. They were embedded in managed landscapes, with infrastructure, resource flow, and cultural signalling baked into the geography. Rendlesham was not a stopover. It was a capital, and it wasn't just big, it was old. The site shows signs of elite occupation and redevelopment over centuries, with architectural foundations suggesting long-term use and continual reconfiguration, evidence of political endurance, not passing fashion. Wooden halls were rebuilt. New precincts were added. Religious and ceremonial functions shifted over time, probably in response to dynastic turnover, regional crises, or shifting power dynamics. What's even more revealing is the connectivity. Rendlesham wasn't isolated. The archaeological record shows clear links with other sites along the Deben estuary, particularly Sutton Hoo, a few miles to the east. That monumental burial site, with its ship and treasure and still unconfirmed occupant, was almost certainly part of the same royal world. Rendlesham may well have been the seat from which the person buried at Sutton Hoo once ruled. That person, possibly King Redwald, the early 7th century ruler mentioned in Bede, now takes on a more dynamic shape. He wasn't just a warlord in a wood-panelled hall. He was a monarch whose authority was enacted through spatial order, religious performance, and material display across a networked royal landscape. New finds from the wider site back that up. High-status jewellery, glassware from the Frankish realms, iron tools for specialised craft production, coins, weapon fragments, and ritual objects that don't easily fall into any single category. Together, they tell a story of wealth, exchange, political signalling, and possibly even diplomatic activity without a single stone castle in sight. One of the more fascinating discoveries is how the boundaries were structured. Ditches and earthworks were designed not just for defence, but for processional movement, guiding people, animals and goods along routes that reflected the hierarchy of those involved. Their suggestion of zoning, of liminal spaces, thresholds that separated the sacred from the secular, the ruler from the ruled. Not unlike modern government buildings where the architecture does half the talking. Perhaps the most surprising element of all is the implication that Rendlesham, and by extension Sutton Hoo, was not exceptional. It was elite, yes, but not a one-off. It's likely that multiple royal centres across early medieval England operated in similar ways. Rendlesham just happens to be the one we're seeing most clearly now, and that visibility matters. For too long, the early English monarchy has been painted in tones of mystery and mud, distant, poorly documented, largely inferred. But now we have landscape as evidence, soil as archive, roads and ditches and post holes as paragraphs in a political text. It turns out kingship didn't just happen in cloaks and coronations, it happened in logistics, in layout, and with each new survey, Rendlesham speaks louder. Yet even as archaeologists stitched together this grand tapestry of pre-Christian kingship, something ancient, far older than any throne, was about to speak from under the coronation chair itself, a stone that refused to stay silent. 8. Stone of Destiny. New scans, 2023. You might think a 152-kilogram slab of red sandstone would be hard to lose track of. And yet, the Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone, has a long history of being not quite where it's supposed to be. Sometimes it's under the coronation chair, sometimes it's buried beneath an abbey. Once, it was under a student's bed in Glasgow. For something so heavy, the stone moves with uncanny ease. But in 2023, it wasn't the stone's location that stirred interest. It was what lay inside it. In preparation for King Charles III's coronation, conservationists and historians were given rare access to the Stone of Destiny. As part of its scheduled transfer from Edinburgh Castle to Westminster Abbey, a full battery of non-invasive scans and digital imaging was conducted, meant at first as routine documentation. Instead, it turned into an archaeological episode of Reveal the Relic. Using cutting-edge 3D imaging, photogrammetry, and microsurface analysis, researchers mapped the stone surface in stunning resolution. What they found weren't just natural fractures and chisel marks, but a set of previously unrecorded symbols, faint, almost invisible to the naked eye, but undeniably artificial. Some resembled carved letters or pictographs. Others looked more like tool impressions. And at least one symbol appeared geometric, echoing early Celtic or Pictish design. None of them matched modern tampering. These were ancient, embedded within the stone itself, likely carved centuries, perhaps over a millennium, before its more theatrical moments in royal history. The public reaction was mixed: excitement, confusion, predictable cries of conspiracy. But among historians, The implications were electrifying, because until then, most accounts had framed the Stone of Destiny as a symbol, not an artifact, a tool of myth, not a carrier of its own story. Its earliest mention in recorded law places it in Scotland, at the Abbey of Scone, used in the coronation of Scottish kings since at least the 9th century. But legends stretch further back, some claiming it came from Ireland or even the Holy Land. Others suggest it was Jacob's pillow from the Book of Genesis, spirited across continents by fate and poor navigation. These stories, while romantic, were always treated as apocryphal, part of the stone's charm, not its provenance. But the 2023 scans changed that. They didn't prove any of the wilder theories, but they complicated the timeline. The markings suggest the stone may have had a ceremonial function long before it arrived in Scone, or even in Scotland at all, and that's unsettling because it challenges not only the stone's origin story, but also the mythology of the British monarchy itself. The monarchy has long relied on the idea of continuity, that the coronation stone, the throne, the sword, the regalia, they're not just props, they're the threads that stitch centuries together, symbols of legitimacy, of order. But what if one of those symbols turns out to have belonged to someone else first? Someone pre-Christian, pre-feudal, pre-imperial? What if the coronation itself, ostensibly the most British of ceremonies, is built atop a relic stolen from an older, deeper ritual tradition? This isn't just an academic puzzle, it's a crisis of meaning. The stone's mystery isn't whether it's authentic, it's whether its authenticity means something other than what we thought. To complicate things further, the digital scans also revealed signs of surface repair and patchwork, likely from earlier centuries, moments when the stone cracked, chipped, or was purposefully altered. Some of these may trace back to the 1296 heist, when Edward I stole the stone and dragged it to Westminster as a symbol of English domination over Scotland. Others may come from the famous 1950 incident when 4 Scottish students stole it back and accidentally broke it in two during transit. Those events are well documented, but the pre-1296 markings are not, and those are the ones that raise questions. Who carved them? For what purpose? And why weren't they recorded until now? Of course, there are those who say we're reading too much into scratches, that pattern-seeking minds always invent stories, that a stone is just a stone. But that's never been true in Britain, not when it's under a throne. So the scans were completed, the digital model published, the coronation carried out, and the stone, true to form, was returned to Edinburgh Castle with the same ceremonial dignity that's always obscured its stranger past. But the story didn't stop there, because just a few months later, a long-rumoured chip of the stone surfaced in the hands of a nationalist family. And this time, the tests were even more specific. 9. Stone of Destiny. Fragment authenticated. 2024. By now, the Stone of Destiny had become almost too symbolic to question. A 152-kilogram icon of kingship, national identity, and unresolved tension between Scotland and England. People knelt before it. Oaths were sworn above it. It had been stolen, broken, restored, and paraded across borders more times than any ceremonial object deserves. But still, it endured, solid, immovable, foundational. So when, in early 2024, a modest chip of red sandstone, no larger than a slice of shortbread, surfaced from a private family collection in Arbroath, the timing felt absurd, like a lost piece of Excalibur showing up in a biscuit tin. The story at first seemed too tidy. The family claimed the fragment had been passed down quietly since 1950, when the stone was stolen from Westminster Abbey by 4 Scottish students. A nationalist act wrapped in youthful mischief that saw the relic broken in two during transit. Though the stone was later repaired and returned in secret, rumours had long persisted that a piece was quietly kept as a souvenir, or, depending on your perspective, a relic of liberation. For decades, the chip remained tucked away. Family legend, nothing more. Until now. In early 2024, emboldened by the renewed academic attention to the stone's surface markings and historical context, the family reached out, first to a local historian, then to Historic Environment Scotland. What followed was one of the more surreal moments in the recent history of British royal archaeology. A team of scientists preparing to analyze a long whispered fragment of the object on which monarchs are crowned. Tests began cautiously: petrographic analysis, X-ray fluorescence, microscopic comparison with 3D scans from the 2023 imaging project. The goal wasn't just to determine whether the fragment was made of the same sandstone, but whether it had broken off in a way consistent with the damage sustained during the 1950 incident. The results came in quietly. A few academic papers, a press release that was more cautious than triumphant, but the conclusions were clear. The fragment matched. Same origin, same mineral signature, same microfracture pattern. It was not just similar to the Stone of Destiny, it was part of it. And just like that, the myth became evidence. For historians, the discovery was affirming. Proof that oral history, however strange or sentimental, can still be right. For archaeologists, it was an opportunity to analyze a part of the stone that had been physically separated, offering new angles on how it was shaped, damaged and repaired. But for everyone else, for the public, the press and particularly Scottish nationalists, it became a parable, because in this tiny fragment was everything the stone itself had come to represent: division, unity, memory, resistance, a piece of a contested whole, removed, preserved, rediscovered, just in time for another round of constitutional debate. Commentators were quick to assign symbolism. Some saw the fragment as a metaphor for Scotland's fractured relationship with the Crown. Others read it as a sign of cultural resilience, proof that even ceremonial power can splinter. There were even whispers that the chip should be kept separate from the stone, placed in a museum, or perhaps returned to Arbroath Abbey, where the Declaration of Scottish Independence had been signed in 1320. Naturally, political figures couldn't resist. Some MSPs called for the chip to remain in Scotland permanently as a symbol of cultural restitution. Others, more cautious, warned against fetishizing stolen relics, and somewhere in the noise, the original family, still quiet, still proud, watched the chip they had guarded like a family secret become something else, a state-level conversation piece. Yet in all the uproar, one strange fact remained largely undiscussed. The fragment was real, it matched, but there may be more. That is, if one fragment survived, separated during a hasty return and hidden in a cupboard for 70 years, who's to say others didn't too? The 1950 heist, once dismissed as youthful rebellion, is now being re-examined with forensic curiosity. Were more pieces taken, given away, lost in transit? And if the stone isn't whole, if pieces remain scattered across Scotland in teacups and drawers and estate boxes, then the very thing it was supposed to represent, unity, may have never fully returned. Which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the symbol of sovereign continuity is itself fragmented? And while scholars debated what to do with the newly authenticated chip, others began asking a different question altogether, one not about provenance but about location. Because 2024 brought more than just a chip of the stone, it brought a hunt, a search to recover what else might be missing. 10. Stone of Destiny. Hunt for Scattered Pieces, 2024. By the spring of 2024, the discovery and authentication of the small Stone of Destiny fragment had moved from novelty to national fixation. What began as a humble heirloom in a linen drawer had become a matter of cultural identity and historical revision, but the questions that followed were bigger and much less symbolic. If one fragment of the coronation stone had survived, concealed in private hands for over 70 years, could there be more? That's when the hunt began. Quietly at first, through whispers among collectors, archivists, and Scottish heritage circles. Then publicly, as Historic Environment Scotland confirmed it was reviewing tips and records from the 1950 heist, the infamous student-led removal of the stone from Westminster Abbey, which accidentally split it in two. The official narrative had always been that the stone was repaired before its eventual anonymous return in 1951. But now that story was up for revision. The fracture marks on the authenticated chip suggested a secondary, incomplete repair, one that left a gap too small to notice but large enough to be missing something. And with new forensic scans, that missing something had a shape, a pattern, an absence measurable to the millimetre. In short, there were likely multiple fragments unaccounted for. This ignited a sort of low-key national treasure hunt, not of blockbuster proportions, but of archival sleuthing and forensic dusting. Amateur historians re-examined estate sale inventories. Antique dealers began posting stone chips for sale with wild, hopeful descriptions. Some were laughably fake. Hunks of red granite from garden borders, coronation pebbles allegedly passed down from clans with no ties to the stone story. Others were more ambiguous, small unmarked pieces of sandstone that bore a suspicious resemblance to the real thing. But the serious leads came from unexpected places. One was a private school archive in Fife, where a headmaster in the 1950s reportedly gave a graduation speech about a piece of Scotland's crown lying in our chapel. The claim had been dismissed for decades as metaphor, a flourish. Now conservators were scanning the chapel's altar. Another tip emerged from the papers of a stonemason in Glasgow who had once worked on the stone's reassembly in secret, under instructions from nationalist intermediaries. His logbooks contained not only descriptions of the repair process, but hand-drawn sketches of what appeared to be a missing sliver, broken during handling but deemed irrelevant to function. That sliver, the notes implied, had been gifted to a gentleman from Perth. No name was given. Soon after, a local historical society in Perth received an anonymous package, a palm-sized sandstone fragment wrapped in tartan cloth. No note, just coordinates on a scrap of paper pointing to Scone Abbey. None of these discoveries by themselves were definitive, but together they formed a growing mosaic of possibility. That the stone of destiny as we know it today, on display in Edinburgh Castle, occasionally carted down to Westminster for coronations, may not be the entire stone. That what is displayed as unity may, in truth, be incomplete. For the Scottish public, this wasn't just academics, it was personal. The stone has long been a lightning rod for discussions of identity, independence, and the legacy of conquest. To find it fragmented is to find those arguments reanimated. To find pieces still out there, still hidden in homes and archives, is to be reminded that not all acts of rebellion are erased by apology. Some are just deferred, and there's something haunting about that. That every coronation since 1953 may have taken place above a restored relic that isn't fully restored. That an object meant to bind the realm might be scattered across it, not lost, just waiting to be found, or maybe to stay hidden, depending on who's looking. The 2024 fragment hunt became, in a way, a ghost story told in geological terms. Not about spirits, but about symbolic residue. The kind of haunting that doesn't creak or whisper, it just sits in your national consciousness, like a stone under a throne, shifting slightly when no one's watching. But not all royal discoveries come from ghost stories or accidents. Some are found by sheer stubbornness. As the stone yielded its chips, another long-lost palace, tied not to monarchs in power, but to one who made kings, was about to re-emerge from 500 years of silence. Hidden beneath gardens, traced by ground radar, and claimed by someone who was never crowned, but crowned others. Lady Margaret Beaufort's ghost was stirring, and Collie Weston was finally giving up its shape. 11. Western Palace, Lady Margaret Beaufort's. There are royal palaces you can tour. There are palaces you can see on mugs and tea towels and awkward jigsaw puzzles in gift shops. And then there's Western, the kind of place that, until very recently, lived mostly in footnotes, field reports, and the unverified memories of local gardeners. And yet, for over 500 years, this was the private kingdom of Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, and possibly the most influential woman in late medieval England. Architect of a dynasty, mastermind behind the rise of the Tudors, and now, once again, the centre of a very modern mystery solved not in ink, but in soil. Western Palace was never meant to be forgotten. In its prime, it was a sprawling Tudor estate perched above the Welland Valley in Northamptonshire. More than a royal residence, it was a command centre, a place of plotting and power brokering, where Lady Margaret received ambassadors, arranged marriages, and quietly dictated the future of the English throne. After her death in 1509, the palace faded quickly. The crown changed hands, tastes evolved, and Western became functionally obsolete, its stone quarried, its layout muddied, its presence slowly erased beneath gardens, farm tracks, and polite Georgian landscaping. For centuries, people knew of it, but no one really knew where it was. That changed in 2023, when after 5 years of quietly persistent archaeological work by a local heritage group, with support from Historic England and regional universities, the palace was located, mapped, and partially unearthed. What they found wasn't just a few bricks or odd tiles. It was a footprint, clear, deliberate, and far grander than many had imagined. Through a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, aerial photography, and old-fashioned trowel work, the team uncovered substantial stone foundations, drainage channels, wall alignments, and even the faint ghost of a great hall. Enough to reconstruct not just the building, but the rhythm of life that once moved through it. This wasn't a side estate, it was a major residence, on par with smaller royal palaces like Eltham or Sheen, and more importantly, it confirmed what some historians had long suspected but couldn't prove, that Western was the nerve centre of Lady Margaret's late political career. The palace layout supports this. The Great Hall was large enough for official gatherings. The private chapel, once thought to be modest, had its own unique architectural axis, suggesting it was designed for a woman of singular devotional intensity. Servants' quarters, kitchens, and guest lodgings all suggest a residence built to host, observe, and influence, not just retreat. This is where Margaret negotiated power, not with swords, but with strategy, not through public performance, but via rooms arranged for listening, waiting, and pulling strings from behind. The curtain. It's where she helped orchestrate her son's rise to power in 1485. It's where she shaped the early education of Henry VIII. And it's likely where more than a few deals, marital, diplomatic, ecclesiastical, were sealed over supper. The rediscovery is also architectural vindication. For years, Western had been written off by mainstream Tudor historians as a footnote estate, important socially perhaps, but irrelevant in terms of design or grandeur. The excavation proves otherwise. Decorative fragments of stained glass, high-status floor tiles, and Flemish brick suggest a palace built not merely for function, but for status display. This was a queen-maker's court. Even more poignantly, the palace's rediscovery reframes Lady Margaret herself. Too often she's portrayed in binaries: the cold matriarch, the scheming saint, the political nun. But Western complicates that. It shows her as a builder, a planner, a patron. A woman who created space, literal space, for power to flow through her. And in that space, history was made, quietly, permanently. Today, Western is being further excavated and digitally reconstructed. The goal is to recreate the estate in virtual form, allowing the public to step inside a world that shaped the Tudors long before they ruled with grandeur. But even now, the first finds, the hearths, the thresholds, the corridor stubs leading nowhere are reshaping how we tell the story of a dynasty's origins. And in the silence of those unearthed stones, something unexpected emerges. Not just a palace, but a presence. Because Collyweston wasn't the end of the mystery of lost royal faces and forgotten legacies. In fact, 2025 brought something even more tantalizing. Not a building this time, but a face, or what might be one. And it might belong to the Queen, who reigned for 9 days. 12. Lady Jane Grey, Potential Lifetime Portrait, 2025. The face of Lady Jane Grey has always been something of a ghost. The so-called 9 Days Queen has lingered in the English imagination as a tragic phantom, young, doomed, brilliant, and barely visible. Her name appears in textbooks and cautionary tales, but her face, that's been guesswork. Portraits once attributed to her have been debunked, reassigned, or exposed as wishful thinking in oil and varnish. For centuries, Lady Jane Grey has existed without a confirmed likeness. That may have changed in 2025. The announcement came from English Heritage, and it arrived with the kind of cautious optimism that signals just how uncertain these waters are. They had been reviewing their collection in preparation for a major exhibition on Tudor queens, not just the crowned, but the nearly crowned, the sidelined, the erased. It was part PR campaign, part historiographical correction. What they found was a panel portrait, long believed to depict an unknown woman of the mid-Tudor court. It had been catalogued, cleaned, and largely ignored. A fine example of early Elizabethan portraiture dated broadly between 1539 and 1571. Nothing overtly unusual. The subject wore a French hood, a modest but well-made gown, and a look of poised melancholy. Nothing labelled her as anyone in particular, but then someone looked closer. First came the redating of the wood panel using dendrochronology, the tree ring analysis technique often used to confirm the age of art objects. The panel was cut from oak felled no later than 1548. That narrowed the portrait's creation to a short window between then and the early 1550s. Next came the costume study, the style of hood, the sleeve cut, the jewelled girdle, all consistent with elite English fashion in the reign of Edward VI, not Elizabeth and not Mary, which put the portrait in the orbit of Lady Jane Grey's brief but turbulent time at court. The real twist, however, came from inscription analysis. A faint Latin motto etched into the frame had once been dismissed as a generic religious phrase. Veritas temporis filia, or truth is the daughter of time. Common enough, but pigment traces revealed an earlier layer of text beneath it, partially scraped away. Using infrared imaging and pigment spectroscopy, conservators reconstructed part of that original inscription. It appeared to contain the initials JG and a date fragment ending in 53, both incomplete, both maddening, but not dismissible. At that point, the reattribution started to feel less speculative and more like a possibility waiting for courage. Art historians then turned to facial comparison, comparing the portrait's features with known Grey family members, including a later confirmed portrait of Catherine Grey, Jane's sister. The resemblance was strong, not definitive but evocative. The same elongated nose, the same high forehead, the same sharpness around the eyes, like a mind trained on Latin declensions and political disaster. There's also the age of the subject to consider. The woman in the portrait appears to be in her mid-teens, an unusual age to be formally painted unless she held some importance. And in 1553, Jane Grey was about 16. The image, once dismissed as an anonymous court lady, suddenly took on new gravity. Of course, nothing is certain. The portrait has not yet been definitively confirmed as Jane Grey, but it's the strongest candidate in decades, and English Heritage has cautiously labelled it a probable identification. That's as close as any historical mystery gets to solved without a signed autograph and a crown in the frame. If it is her, then it's not just a face regained, it's a reframing, because the expression on this woman's face is not naive, not innocent in the romanticized sense. It is composed, controlled. She looks like someone who knows, and that's unsettling. We have long imagined Jane as a girl swept away by dynastic politics, a martyr of Protestant ambition. But if this is her portrait, painted during or just before her fateful elevation to queen, it shows someone with startling self-possession. Not just a pawn, possibly a player. It's a face that asks as many questions as it answers. What did she think of her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, who engineered her rise? Did she believe she had a divine right to rule, or was she simply obeying orders wrapped in piety? Did she ever really want the crown? A portrait won't answer those questions, but it reopens them, and it reminds us that even the shortest reign leaves long shadows, especially when it disappears without a trace until perhaps one is found behind varnish and frame. But while art was busy reconstructing the face of a girl queen, science was solving a much smaller but equally royal mystery. A puzzle barely larger than a postage stamp, one that had been misidentified for centuries, passed between curators like an orphaned trinket. And this time, the subject wasn't misremembered. She was misnamed. 13. Mary Tudor Miniature Re-Identified 2024. It sat quietly for decades, tucked into drawers, moved between inventories, admired occasionally by portrait specialists who had mostly made peace with its uncertain identity. A tiny painted oval, just a few centimeters tall, mounted on vellum and backed in copper. To the untrained eye, it was simply another example of Tudor miniature portraiture, exquisitely detailed, deeply symbolic, maddeningly ambiguous. For years, the woman in the miniature had been labelled Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII. It was a tidy attribution. The style of dress matched the mid-16th century. The jewellery, restrained but expensive, fit the conservative dignity Catherine was known for. And besides, who else could it be? Apparently, someone else entirely. In 2024, a cross-institutional study led by curators at the National Portrait Gallery and the Courtauld Institute re-examined the miniature as part of a broader project to digitally reassess high-value items in the royal collection. The team had no intention of rewriting royal iconography, but what they found shook one of the smaller pillars of Tudor portraiture. The woman in the image wasn't Catherine Parr. It was Mary Tudor, the future Mary I, England's first crowned queen regnant. And once the switch was made, it became impossible to unsee. The first clue came through infrared reflectography, which revealed faint underdrawings beneath the painted surface. Sketch marks that suggested the miniature's facial structure had been adjusted mid-process. Most notably, the shape of the eyebrows and the curve of the upper lip had been changed. These subtle tweaks, invisible without imaging, were hallmarks of court miniaturist Lucas Hornbout, who had painted multiple members of the Tudor court, often under strict political instruction. Then came the insignia study. A previously overlooked brooch, tiny, nearly indistinct in the original painting, was enhanced through digital magnification. It featured a stylized pomegranate, worn not prominently, but tucked just near the shoulder. The pomegranate had long been the emblem of Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, and a silent protest symbol used by Mary herself during her years of political and religious marginalization under Edward VI. Catherine Parr had no association with the pomegranate, but Mary, that was her birthright. Still, the evidence needed more than symbolism and sketch lines. The team turned to comparative analysis, cross-referencing known, confirmed portraits of Mary the Voice from later in her reign. One particularly telling feature was the structure of the eyes, almond-shaped, slightly heavy-lidded, with a gaze that appeared direct and almost confrontational. It matched known depictions and, crucially, did not match other verified portraits of Catherine Parr. The final piece was the timeline. The miniature's materials, particularly the style of the attire and the pigment used in the background, dated it to around 1544 to 1546, when Mary was in her late 20s. This was the exact window when she had been restored to court by Henry VIII and was once again appearing in public as a royal daughter of status, if not full legitimacy. In short, she had motive, means and opportunity to commission, or be commissioned for, a portrait. Why had it taken so long to correct? Part of it is institutional inertia. Once a label is assigned, it tends to stick. Part of it is that Mary remains an uncomfortable figure. Her reign is remembered often unfairly through the lens of failure and fire. Her portraits are scrutinized with suspicion. When people think of Mary, they picture her older, darker, sharper. This miniature shows her younger, composed, watchful. It's a version of Mary that few have bothered to remember because it doesn't fit the narrative. But it fits her. The reattribution, now officially accepted by both English Heritage and the Royal Collection Trust, reframes more than just one image. It reminds us how easily the women of the Tudor court, especially those who weren't universally loved by history, can be misplaced even when they're right in front of us. And it reopens the question of how many more misidentified likenesses might be hiding in plain sight, miscatalogued not by malice but by convenience. It also reveals something darker, that royal identity can be painted over, not erased exactly but overwritten. That even a queen's face can be forgotten if the story around it becomes too politically inconvenient. But not all royal traces are forgotten through error. Some are intentionally buried, hidden between the margins of prayer books, inscribed in ink, scribbled by a king who never wanted to be known for what he wrote but couldn't stop writing anyway. Because in 2023, someone noticed what Henry VIII had been hiding in his own wife's book. 14. Henry VIII's Own Jottings, 2023. For all his appetite for power, wives and ceremony, Henry VIII was not widely known as a man of introspection. He preferred declarations to reflections, edicts to epigrams. His legacy was forged in marble, not ink. His truths proclaimed through acts of parliament, not diary margins. But kings, even the most theatrical ones, are still human. And in 2023, a centuries-old prayer book quietly revealed that Henry VIII, of all people, wrote in the margins. The book in question was no minor volume. It belonged to Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, the one who outlived him, and the only one who dared publish under her own name while still married to the king. Her book, Prayers or Meditations, was first published in 1545 and was one of the first religious texts authored by a woman in the English language to be printed and distributed publicly. A quiet revolution in piety and politics. One surviving copy of that work, held in the collections of Durham University, had long been assumed to be Catherine's personal edition. It was lavish, certainly, bound in red velvet, decorated with hand-gilded edges, a gift-worthy item, but nothing beyond what you'd expect for a queen consort with Protestant leanings and literary ambition. And then, in early 2023, during a digitization project for Tudor-era devotional materials, a conservationist noticed something faint in the margins, indistinct, tiny, browned by time. Not the printed text, but handwritten annotations, barely visible unless you tilted the page just right under filtered light. What followed was a forensic storm. Under multispectral imaging, the faded writing was enhanced, revealing a series of brief notations, underlinings, and what appeared to be personal prayers and reactions to the text. But the handwriting was the real shock. Tight, angular, unmistakably Tudor court style, and strikingly similar to known samples of Henry VIII's own hand. Experts from multiple institutions, including the British Library and the University of York, were brought in to examine and compare the script. By mid-year, a scholarly consensus had quietly emerged. The annotations were almost certainly made by Henry VIII himself. This was not idle doodling. The king had read his wife's book carefully, thoughtfully, and had responded to it in ink. The content of the jottings was subtle but revealing. Next to passages emphasizing divine mercy, Henry had written brief Latin invocations. Miserere mei, Domine, have mercy on me, Lord. On a page discussing the Christian obligation to forgive, he underlined entire phrases and added a single word in English: difficult. In a section reflecting on the transience of earthly kingship, the king had written what appeared to be a personal aside. Power is a burden if not received in grace. They weren't declarations, they were admissions. And in the context of Henry's late life, a period marked by illness, paranoia, excommunication, and the crumbling weight of his own reformation, these notes read like something close to conscience. Not full-blown remorse, perhaps, but awareness. The significance of the find isn't just literary, it's psychological. It reopens the question of who Henry VIII really was in those final years, not just the tyrant, but the man who, faced with his own failing body and fractured legacy, found himself reading a book by his wife and whispering back to it on the page. Some historians suggest the annotations may reflect Henry's declining mental state. Others argue they demonstrate genuine theological engagement, a rare moment when the author of England's religious upheaval grappled privately with the soul it cost him. Either way, it's an inversion. For once, Henry VIII was not the author, but the reader. Not the commanding voice, but the marginal one. Even more ironically, his wife, the woman who once had to walk a tightrope between religious reformer and queenly obedience, was the one guiding his thoughts. The book is now being restudied and republished, with Henry's annotations integrated into a new facsimile edition. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the discovery is not what the king wrote, but how little he wrote. Just a few brief notes, a few underlinings, a handful of words scattered like quiet apologies. They say handwriting is a kind of fingerprint. In this case, it's a faint shadow of guilt, of weight, of late life clarity. And speaking of fingerprints, the next mystery came not from a king's hand, but from something worn on the body. A golden object unearthed in a field, carved, delicate, unmistakable. It bore two letters, H and K, entwined in gold. And those initials? They could only belong to one royal pairing. 15. HK Tudor Pendant, 2023. It surfaced, as these things so often do, by accident. A metal detectorist, legal, licensed, and blissfully unaware of the historical hand grenade about to go off, was sweeping a quiet field in Warwickshire in early 2023 when his machine let out that stubborn, high-pitched whine that says, "Dig here." He expected a coin, maybe a clasp. Instead, he pulled up a jewel, not just any jewel, a solid gold, heart-shaped pendant, exquisitely preserved, coated in enamel, decorated with red and white roses, and suspended from a chain of delicate, twisted links. On one side, the Tudor rose in full bloom. On the other, two intertwined initials, bold and unmistakable, H and K Henry and Catherine. Specifically, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Within days, the pendant was in the hands of the British Museum, which promptly called it one of the most significant Tudor-era discoveries of the last decade. And not just because of its craftsmanship, though it was extraordinary, with intricate etching and enamel work more commonly found in royal workshops than in personal keepsakes, but because of what it represented, a moment of allegiance, frozen in gold. The immediate question, of course, was authenticity. Could this be a modern fake, a Victorian romance piece, a lost prop from a long-forgotten period drama? The answer, after several months of careful analysis, was clear. It was real. The enamel, goldwork, soldering, and stylistic elements all pointed firmly to the early 16th century, likely dating to around 1520. the high point of Henry and Catherine's marriage, during the years before Anne Boleyn entered the frame and everything began to unravel. What makes this pendant so fascinating is its deliberate symbolism. The intertwined initials, common in Tudor courtly love tokens, appear again in surviving artifacts, but rarely with this degree of personal resonance. The white and red roses hint at unity, both political, the fusion of York and Lancaster in the Tudor line, and marital. The heart shape, while conventional to us, was still emerging in visual culture at the time as a romantic motif, making the piece cutting edge in its day. More importantly, this wasn't likely something worn by Henry or Catherine themselves. It was a gift, almost certainly given by the king or queen to a favoured courtier or lady-in-waiting. A sign of favour, a marker of inner circle intimacy. In that sense, it functioned like a royal signature, an unspoken message that said, "You are trusted," but the pendant's real impact lies in its timing. By 1520, Catherine had given Henry one surviving child, Mary, but no male heir. Their marriage, while still officially strong, was entering the long shadow of dynastic anxiety. And yet here, cast in gold and likely expensive to commission, was a declaration of affection, of stability, possibly even of hope. This pendant doesn't just depict a love story. It challenges one of the most deeply embedded narratives in Tudor history, that Henry and Catherine's relationship was always defined by failure, that she was the queen who couldn't produce a son, that her value faded, that his affection evaporated. Here, instead, is proof of something else, that before all the annulments, trials, and theological upheaval, there was a time when Henry wore her initial close to his heart, literally. And yet, like all Tudor stories, this one contains a bitter echo, because we know what came next. Within a decade, that same H would be entwined with a different letter. B for Boleyn, then J for Jane, then C, then H again, then K again, but never the same K. The pendant, now on display and the subject of numerous scholarly articles, is a glittering contradiction. A symbol of permanence from one of the most impermanent monarchs in British history. But there's something even deeper. This object wasn't buried by accident. It wasn't lost. It was placed, carefully, probably hidden, perhaps to protect its owner after Henry changed his mind, and changed the country with it. And buried with it was a quiet truth. Symbols outlive sentiment. Gold lasts longer than favour. Initials endure even when the promises behind them do not. Still, the people wearing these symbols weren't always English. As a different kind of discovery would soon reveal, not everyone aboard Henry VIII's greatest ship was born under his flag, and the Mary Rose had secrets left to surface. 16. Mary Rose Crew Origins, 2021. When the Mary Rose was raised from the Solent in 1982, it was called a miracle. A half-preserved Tudor warship, sunken for over 400 years, returned to the light. The starboard side still intact, its timbers waterlogged but remarkably whole. Inside, thousands of artifacts, cannons, longbows, combs, coins, dice, rosaries. Shoes still moulded to long-gone feet, a battlefield snapshot of Henry VIII's navy frozen in time. But one question lingered in the murk, despite all the swords and spoons and strategy manuals. Who were the men aboard? For decades, that question was answered in the broadest terms. English sailors, Tudor subjects, loyal servants of the king. The wreck was treated as a national artifact. Its contents, its construction, even its tragedy, absorbed into a larger narrative about England's martial past. And then came the science. In 2021, a group of researchers led by the University of Portsmouth, working in partnership with the Mary Rose Trust, applied a suite of bioarchaeological techniques to the remains of 8 individuals recovered from the wreck. Using multi-isotope analysis, DNA sequencing, and advanced facial reconstruction, they weren't just examining bones, they were reconstructing identities. The results rewrote the crew list. Of the 8 men studied, several showed clear markers of non-English origin. One man, found near the bow and thought to be of relatively high rank due to the quality of his possessions, had isotopic signatures suggesting he spent his youth in North Africa or the southern Mediterranean. His DNA showed North African ancestry, likely from the Maghreb region, modern-day Morocco, Algeria or Tunisia. Another crew member had Spanish and Welsh genetic markers. A third showed traits consistent with Southern European descent, likely from southern Italy or the Balkans. And others, though likely raised in England, still bore genetic links to continental Europe, suggesting a diverse heritage, even among those born on British soil. In short, the Mary Rose was not just crewed by Englishmen. It was an early multicultural vessel, reflecting a far more complex vision of Tudor society than most schoolbooks suggest. This wasn't merely a curiosity. It fundamentally changed how historians thought about the Tudor navy and the social structure of the early 16th century. Far from being a closed, insular island kingdom, England, especially its naval and port cities, was deeply connected to broader European and Mediterranean worlds. Sailors, artisans, gunners, and cooks may have come from across the seas to work, live, and die under the English crown. And here's the thing: Henry VIII knew. His government actively recruited foreign specialists. Cannoneers from the Low Countries, shipwrights from Italy, mercenaries from Spain. England was a rising military power, but still lacked the seasoned technical expertise of older naval states, so they hired it in, quietly and pragmatically. The Mary Rose is proof of that pragmatism. A warship designed to project power and staffed, in part, by people from the very regions that England would later see as rivals or threats. History, it turns out, has never been good at maintaining its own ideological boundaries. For the public, the findings were both inspiring and uncomfortable. They challenged the nostalgic image of the brave English sailor and replaced it with something messier, more accurate, and more interesting. A ship of languages, of mixed heritages, of shared risk. A reminder that national identity, even in the age of Henry VIII, was never singular. The new portraits, reconstructed digitally using skeletal data and forensic imaging, now stand beside the Mary Rose exhibit in Portsmouth. Visitors see not just artifacts, but faces, some dark-skinned, some fair, all human, all Tudor, all lost to the sea together. And yet, for all that the Mary Rose gave back, its crew, its cargo, its cautionary tale, it was still, in the end, a shipwreck. Its story frozen in death. But another ship, only recently uncovered, told a different story. This one never quite vanished, never quite made the headlines. A wooden hull resting in the shifting sands of Kent, Tudor-built, trade-weathered, mysteriously intact, and for centuries it lay silent beneath Dungeness, until it didn't. 17. Dungeness Tudor Ship 2022. The Dungeness coastline has always had a kind of bleak charm, flat, exposed, oddly lunar. The kind of place where time gets lost in the fog and where the sea seems to inch forward without hurry or regret. It's littered with shipwrecks, sure, but most of them belong to more recent maritime dramas. 19th century cargo disasters, rusting trawlers, forgotten fishing boats embedded in shingle. And then, in 2022, the beach revealed something that had been waiting for over 4 centuries. A routine coastal erosion survey, nothing glamorous, just standard coastal monitoring work by Historic England, spotted a row of heavy blackened timbers emerging from the sand near Dungeness Point. At first glance, they looked like nothing special. Old breakwater maybe, or driftwood fossilized by salt and time. But the grain pattern was too clean, the cuts too deliberate. This wasn't nature at work, it was shipbuilding. Within weeks, a full archaeological team was on site, carefully excavating what turned out to be the well-preserved hull of a Tudor-era merchant ship buried just below the surface for nearly 500 years. Radiocarbon dating and dendrochronological analysis placed its construction firmly between 1558 and 1580, overlapping with the reign of Elizabeth I. That alone would have been cause for interest. Tudor-era wrecks are rare, especially ones this intact, but it was the condition of the ship that made it extraordinary. The keel, planking, and ribs had survived in remarkably good shape thanks to the anaerobic silts of the Dungeness marshes, which had essentially vacuum-sealed the wreck from oxygen and rot. Unlike the Mary Rose, this vessel wasn't pulled from the seabed in pieces. It revealed itself plank by plank, with most of its lower hull still articulated. The ship wasn't large, estimated at around 12 to 15 meters in length, but its design spoke volumes. It was oak-built, with framing techniques matching English construction methods from the mid-16th century. Traces of pitch and resin clung to the internal seams. A few iron nails, rivets, and a carved wooden pulley block were recovered from the wreckage, along with fragments of barrel hoops and pottery. What emerged was a picture of a small, sturdy coastal trader, likely used for short-haul journeys between Kent, Sussex, and the Low Countries. This was no warship. It was a working vessel, a Tudor lorry, if you will, hauling goods like wool, salt, or hops across the channel. Its survival, so close to the surface and so near to a busy coast, was both improbable and instructive. Because the Dungeness ship fills in a gap that's long haunted maritime historians. What about the ordinary vessels? The ones that didn't carry kings or sink in battle or change the course of naval history, but instead kept England's emerging economy afloat. So much Tudor maritime focus centres on grand stories, armadas, galleons, heroic disasters. But the Dungeness find speaks to the quieter, functional side of maritime history, trade, infrastructure, logistics. The empire before it was imperial. The machinery of daily Tudor life, moving cargo through choppy waters while royal dramas unfolded elsewhere. And it hints at a broader truth that the Tudor maritime world was bigger, busier, and more integrated than we give it credit for. Every bolt of cloth in Antwerp, every cask of ale in Calais, every barrel of Kentish apples exported from Rye depended on ships like this one, small, replaceable, mostly invisible to written history. Until now, plans are underway to conserve the remains and eventually display them in a regional heritage centre. Meanwhile, digital scans of the wreck are being used to reconstruct its original shape and to model how such vessels moved, loaded, and were manned. Already, it's changing how educators teach Tudor trade and transport. And perhaps most intriguingly, the ship was found not far from the ancient pilgrimage routes to Canterbury. A world where merchants, monks, and sailors crossed paths constantly, bringing faith, rumour, and plague in equal measure. Because beneath the royal stories lies the infrastructure of a nation being stitched together, timber by timber, tide by tide. And speaking of old structures revealed by time, another discovery was quietly taking shape in the heart of London. Not a ship, but a building. Not lost at sea, but buried under centuries of ceremony. At Westminster Abbey, the dead were about to give up their place, and the living were digging into what royalty had long kept sacred. 18. Westminster Abbey, new sacristy excavations 2020 and build 2025. In London, Westminster Abbey is less a building than it is a kind of national myth, stone made sacred through repetition. Coronations, funerals, royal weddings, poets' graves, war memorials. The place has absorbed so many symbols, it's easy to forget it was once just a functioning abbey, staffed by monks, bustling with prayer, administration, and yes, construction. So when plans were approved to build a new museum and visitor centre, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries project having already opened the doors to loftier spaces above, the architects proposed something more grounded, To dig, not metaphorically, literally. In 2020, ahead of a new building project to create a modern sacristy, a series of pre-construction archaeological digs were launched just outside the abbey's historic walls, to the north of the nave. The assumption? Some disturbed medieval foundations, perhaps a few bits of broken tile or disarticulated bone. A routine, respectful bit of excavation before modernity moved in. What the archaeologists found instead was an unexpected, intact medieval burial ground, accompanied by the remains of an early monastic sacristy structure previously undocumented. The team from Museum of London Archaeology, MOLA, began cautiously expanding the dig, uncovering layer upon layer of foundation stone, drainage systems, pottery fragments, lead-lined coffins, and, most intriguingly, traces of what appeared to be a medieval tiled floor, oriented east-west and likely linked to the abbey's original 13th century infrastructure. This wasn't ceremonial space, it was functional and very likely royal. Early documents had long referenced a great sacristy, once standing beside the abbey, used during state events, coronations, and high holy days. But its location had been lost through centuries of structural expansion, fire, redecoration, and war. Now it had re-emerged, or at least its footprint had. Among the finds were stonework fragments marked with royal insignia, suggesting the sacristy wasn't just ecclesiastical, it was designed to serve the crown, possibly built under Henry III, whose obsessive rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in the 13th century created the Gothic silhouette we know today. Even more intriguing was the density of high-status burials, including several wrapped in lead and placed near the sacristy wall foundations. Radiocarbon dating placed them from the 12th to 14th centuries, potentially connected to royal household members or senior ecclesiastical figures. One partial skeleton showed signs of severe joint deterioration, consistent with monastic life. Another had a healed forearm fracture and an unusual dental pattern, possibly a knight-turned-cleric or a lay brother who had once seen battle. No names, of course, but identities were forming nonetheless. The discovery forced a quiet rethinking of the abbey's northern precinct, not just as spiritual ground, but as a place of royal logistics, where state and church blended into architecture, daily function, and practical ritual. The 2025 construction of the new sacristy building was modified to incorporate these finds rather than cover them. A glass floor is being installed over part of the medieval tiling, allowing future visitors to walk above what was once walked by abbots, priests, and palace staff preparing for the anointing of kings. It's a layered moment. A new sacristy rises where an old one once stood. A space built for 21st century tourism now hovers above 13th century bones. The past isn't just beneath us, it's stacked, stratified, ready to speak if we bother to listen. And speaking of layers, one discovery in 2024 managed to tie together two realms once thought worlds apart: the grave of a medieval king in Germany and a tiny object left behind in Westminster. The link? A piece of silk, and not just any silk, silk that once wrapped an emperor. Because every now and then, royal mysteries don't start with a throne, they start with a thread. 19. Westminster Abbey. Charlemagne's Silk Link 2024. It began, as these things often do, with a bag. A very small, very old, very overlooked bag. Stored for decades in the textile collection of Westminster Abbey, the item had never attracted much attention. Roughly the size of a modern coin purse, it was stitched from delicate fabric, faded now and frayed around the seams, with no surviving label or inscription. Its only obvious feature was its strangeness. The material didn't quite match other English medieval textiles. The weave was unfamiliar. The craftsmanship was exquisite but alien. It had long been assumed to be 13th century ecclesiastical ephemera, the sort of ceremonial accessory that collects dust in monastic wardrobes. Something once carried during a liturgy dropped behind a choir stall and eventually absorbed into the abbey's miscellaneous storage system. Interesting, but not essential. And then, in 2024, someone ran a scan. As part of a renewed conservation push to digitally catalogue the abbey's lesser-known holdings, the bag was subjected to high-resolution imaging and fibre microscopy, revealing that the threads weren't wool or linen as previously assumed, but silk and of a remarkably fine grade. That alone raised eyebrows. Silk in a 13th century English liturgical object wasn't impossible, but this wasn't just any silk, it was Byzantine. Further analysis using spectrometry and comparative textile databases matched the weave pattern and dye composition to a known group of silks linked to the imperial workshops of Constantinople, specifically those used in Charlemagne's reburial shroud in Aachen Cathedral. Yes, that Charlemagne. The silk used in the Westminster bag was a precise match down to the dye molecular structure, with the textile fragments that wrapped the Holy Roman Emperor's body during his reinterment in 1165, when Frederick Barbarossa had him officially canonized and reburied with imperial ceremony. A rare prestige cloth used in an act of royal propaganda that would shape the mythology of medieval kingship for centuries. So how exactly did a matching piece of that same silk end up in a bag in Westminster Abbey? That's the mystery. Theories have emerged, all equally bizarre and compelling. One suggests that the silk came to England as a gift from the Holy Roman Empire, a diplomatic offering to Henry III, who had a known obsession with foreign relics and sacred textiles. Another posits that the bag was constructed from leftover scraps brought back by English pilgrims or clerics who had travelled through Aachen and were given fragments as tokens. But there's a more conspiratorial theory, whispered among textile historians with a mix of amusement and unease, that the silk didn't come as a gift or left over at all, that it was stolen, quietly removed during a diplomatic visit, or smuggled out by an opportunistic monk. After all, Charlemagne's tomb had been opened multiple times over the centuries, and security was not always imperial. Regardless of how it arrived, the implications are remarkable. It suggests that English royal and ecclesiastical circles were in direct contact with continental relic cultures in ways that were not purely symbolic or reverent. They were tactile, practical, material. A sliver of a dead emperor's burial cloth, refashioned into a bag and tucked away for generations, repurposed into new rituals in a new kingdom. It's a reminder that medieval power was always material. Cloth mattered, not just because it was expensive, but because it carried meaning, bloodlines, borders, blessings. A single weave could tie one royal house to another, across empires, across centuries. The Westminster silk now sits under careful conservation, its origins confirmed, its purpose still murky. Some scholars wonder if it was used to carry a relic or even part of a coronation host. Others think it was a status symbol, a whisper of imperial connection held in the hands of abbots who understood the silent language of thread. But no matter its use, the bag leaves behind a troubling irony, that one of the most English royal objects in the abbey may in fact have been woven to wrap a German emperor. And just as we began untangling that continental knot, another English palace, one tied to the birth of Henry VIII and the myth of Elizabeth I, returned to view. Not in myth, in masonry. Beneath paint, plaster and parade grounds, Greenwich had started speaking again.
20. Greenwich Palace remains, reported anew 2024. For all the grandeur associated with the Tudor dynasty, palaces, pageants and portraits in oil, the actual physical remains of their world are often surprisingly elusive. So many of their buildings have been lost to fire, war or the bulldozers of modern progress. Chief among these vanished royal ghosts is Greenwich Palace, once the favourite riverside retreat of Henry VIII and the birthplace of both Mary the Force and Elizabeth I. You'd think such a place, site of coronations, tournaments, marriages, and the birth of a queen who would define an age, would be fiercely preserved. But history, like monarchy, is not always sentimental. After falling out of royal favour in the 17th century, Greenwich Palace was allowed to crumble, and by the 1690s most of it had been flattened to make way for the Royal Naval Hospital, now the Old Royal Naval College, built under the direction of Sir Christopher Wren. But underneath all that classical symmetry, Tudor masonry still lingered, quiet, buried, but never entirely gone. And in 2024, a renewed conservation effort by the Old Royal Naval College revealed how much of it had survived. It wasn't a single grand discovery, but rather a slow drip of corroborated evidence. Fragments of flooring, foundations, water pipes, and architectural joinery, all mapped and contextualized using modern ground-penetrating radar and infrared imaging. Some elements had been known for years but misunderstood or unrecorded. Others were found during routine conservation work on the college's undercroft. Taken together, these discoveries allowed historians and archaeologists to reconstruct key parts of the Tudor palace's original plan. The Privy Garden was more extensive than previously believed. The chapel stood slightly further west than imagined, and the once suspected alignment of the Great Hall, where Henry VIII celebrated the new year with extravagant masques and endless meat, has now been firmly located, with fragments of its sandstone threshold still in situ. More than just architecture, the site offered up a glimpse of life. Shards of Venetian glass, French floor tiles, a carved bone gaming piece, and fragments of oyster shells from royal feasts. Collectively, they painted a vivid picture of international luxury grafted onto an English riverside, reflecting a court that was as performative as it was paranoid. What makes this so significant isn't just the romantic appeal of rediscovering a lost palace, it's what Greenwich represents in the royal imagination. It's the palace of origin stories. Henry VIII was born nearby, raised here, and made it a symbolic seat of his personal mythology. It's where he married Catherine of Aragon, where Anne Boleyn's downfall was plotted, and where Elizabeth I first opened her eyes in a room now lost beneath polished marble. And yet, even in its absence, Greenwich has shaped royal identity. Its echoes are embedded in the narrative of monarchy, often invoked but rarely examined. Now, with this renewed archaeological attention, the site is offering not just data but reclamation, a chance to re-anchor the Tudor legacy in physical space, not just myth. Plans are now underway to integrate the newly uncovered elements into the visitor experience at the Old Royal Naval College. Select floor sections will be exposed under glass, and digital reconstructions will allow guests to walk through the long-vanished galleries in virtual space. But more symbolically, the palace's re-emergence closes a strange loop. The site that gave us a queen known for her golden age now finds itself reanimated in an age obsessed with rediscovery. And yet, even as Greenwich reclaims its space in the royal landscape, another part of the Tudor world, less known, more elusive, remains unsolved. Not a palace, but a battlefield, one whose exact location has evaded historians for centuries. Because somewhere north of London, the ghosts of the Battle of Barnet are still waiting to be found. 21. Battle of Barnet. Renewed 2024 search. It was supposed to be the battle that ended a war. On the misty morning of April 14, 1471, two armies collided somewhere near the town of Barnet, just north of London. On one side, Edward IV, recently returned from exile, fighting to reclaim his throne. On the other, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, whose betrayal of Edward had plunged the Wars of the Roses into fresh chaos. It was one of the most pivotal clashes in English history. Warwick fell in the fighting, the Lancastrian cause collapsed, and Edward regained the crown he would hold until his death. And yet, despite the monumental consequences of the battle, we still don't know exactly where it happened. That enduring mystery, unresolved for more than 550 years, got a serious jolt in 2024 when a new archaeological project led by the Barnet Battlefield Project in partnership with Historic England and local heritage groups launched a renewed search to pinpoint the true location of the battlefield. Previous attempts had been inconclusive. Victorian historians placed the battle vaguely near Barnet, and modern maps had long gestured toward Hadley Green as the likeliest site. But growing skepticism among archaeologists, fueled by topographical inconsistencies and the lack of definitive finds, suggested that the actual battle may have taken place further afield, perhaps even several miles from the traditionally accepted site. So the 2024 initiative returned to first principles, documentary evidence, landscape analysis, and most importantly, metal detection and geophysical survey across a much broader search area than had previously been explored. And this time, something shifted. Over the course of several months, the team recovered dozens of metal artifacts scattered across a previously untested stretch of farmland. Arrowheads, broken blade fragments, buckles, and several lead projectiles, all dated to the mid-15th century. Significantly, the distribution of these finds showed a distinct pattern, consistent with the chaotic movement of troops rather than casual medieval discard. One particularly important discovery came from a ploughed field near Rotham Park, a gilded sword pommel bearing a fragmentary heraldic motif believed to belong to a high-ranking Yorkist retainer, combined with new LiDAR scans revealing subtle earthworks, long invisible to the naked eye. This evidence strongly suggests the battle may have taken place to the west of the previously assumed location. If confirmed, the new site would not only rewrite local history books, it would force a reinterpretation of one of the most decisive moments in the Wars of the Roses. And yet, even with this growing body of evidence, the search remains frustratingly open-ended. The battlefield was chaotic, fog-shrouded, and likely stretched across several miles. Historical accounts are contradictory, and crucially, the dead were removed from
The site within days, many buried in mass graves or privately interred, leaving few skeletal traces behind. The 2024 campaign has reignited public interest, with local councils supporting plans to preserve potential battle-era landscapes and install educational signage, even as excavations continue. But the excitement is matched by a familiar unease. What if we never find it? What if the precise location of Warwick's fall, this man who made and unmade kings, stays lost forever? Maybe that's the point, because the Wars of the Roses were never about permanence. They were a revolving door of dynasties, each claiming legitimacy, each tearing it down again. And the Battle of Barnet, buried in mist and mud and centuries of urban sprawl, might be the perfect metaphor. A decisive moment fated to remain just out of reach. But if some places vanish in fog, others stand eternal in bronze. Or so we thought, until modern scanners revealed that even the most iconic royal monuments can still hold secrets. At Canterbury in 2021, the Black Prince's tomb finally gave up its inner workings, and the mystery wasn't about who was buried, but how he was immortalized. 22. Black Prince Tomb, 2021. In the realm of English royal funerary art, few monuments are as instantly recognizable or as mythologized as the tomb of Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. His effigy lies in Canterbury Cathedral, clad in gleaming bronze armor, hands in prayer, sword at his side, face serene beneath a cast metal helm. For centuries, it has been a fixed image of chivalry, the perfect medieval knight resting forever in sculpted perfection. But in 2021, a team of researchers from the Courtauld Institute of Art, working alongside conservation experts at Canterbury Cathedral, made a quiet but extraordinary breakthrough. Using non-invasive imaging technologies, they conducted the most detailed study ever performed on the effigy,
laser scanning, high-resolution photogrammetry, and endoscopic probes into the monument's hidden cavities. The goal was simple: understand how it was made. The results, however, were not simple at all. What they found was a technical mystery that had puzzled art historians for decades, solved at last. The effigy of the Black Prince, long assumed to be cast in a single piece of bronze, was in fact a composite sculpture, a feat of complex medieval metalwork almost unheard of in 14th century England. The figure was constructed using a lost wax casting technique, likely imported from continental Europe, but adapted in ways that suggested not just technical skill, but collaborative experimentation. The armor pieces, especially the gauntlets and the elaborately detailed sabatons, armored shoes, were cast separately and then meticulously joined with an internal framework hidden inside the tomb. This level of complexity raised new questions. Who commissioned such an advanced design? Who made it? And how did they accomplish it in an era where bronze casting technology in England was still relatively limited? The likeliest answer? Foreign craftsmen, perhaps brought in specifically for the task, working under royal commission with materials and techniques drawn from France or the Low Countries, regions with more advanced traditions in bronze sculpture at the time. But the mystery wasn't only about how the effigy was made, it was also about why it was made like this. The Black Prince died in 1376, 1 year before his father, Edward III, and never became king. But he was the hope of the Plantagenet line, the warrior hero of Crécy and Poitiers, the paragon of medieval kingship that never was. His funeral was a national spectacle, carefully designed to project not grief, but legend. The tomb followed suit. What the 2021 study revealed is that the effigy wasn't just a tribute. It was an engineering project intended to outlast the stone around it. The bronze shell is so robust, so meticulously constructed, that it has withstood centuries of humidity, war, and weathering with minimal degradation. The tomb is, in effect, medieval propaganda engineered for immortality. Even more intriguing were the traces of original pigment discovered in the folds of the armor, deep crimson and blue enamel residues, invisible to the eye but still detectable under ultraviolet light. This means the effigy was once painted, not left in austere bronze. The knight we now see as solemn and stately would have originally appeared radiant, in full color, shimmering like a divine warrior in death. And that changes everything, because the Black Prince's tomb wasn't built to mourn. It was built to perform, to tell a story that history would continue long after his actual deeds were forgotten. In doing so, it helped shape the English idea of royalty, not just as bloodline, but as image, durable, impressive, sacred. And for centuries, that image endured unchallenged. But in 2024, attention returned to the very bones of royal children, those long thought to lie in the tower or beneath it. And once again, Westminster Abbey found itself at the centre of another mystery, still unresolved but newly reframed. Because sometimes the dead speak not in whispers, but in bureaucratic silence. 23. Princes in the Tower Context, 2024. It's one of the oldest mysteries in English royal history, and one of the most stubborn. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, vanished in 1483. Two boys, one aged 12, the other just 9, locked in the Tower of London after their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, assumed the crown as Richard III. They were never seen again. That fact has made them into something else entirely. Symbols, myths, battlegrounds for political guilt. Over 5 centuries later, we still don't know exactly what happened. Were they murdered, hidden, starved, smuggled out? And even if they were murdered, as so many have believed, who ordered it? In 1674, during some routine building works at the tower, workers dug beneath a staircase in the White Tower and discovered a box containing the remains of 2 small skeletons. Charles II, perhaps eager to tie up a lingering national anxiety, declared the mystery solved. The bones were transferred to Westminster Abbey, reinterred in a white marble urn, and labelled without formal examination. Their tomb reads, "Here lie the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, his brother." It was neat, it was ceremonial, it was never actually proven. And in 2024, a fresh review by Historic Royal Palaces, in collaboration with the Abbey's conservation team, reopened the file, not to test the bones themselves, they remain untouched, but to examine the long and strangely quiet aftermath of their discovery. What emerged wasn't a new theory about their fate, but a startlingly clear explanation for why no scientific testing has ever been permitted. For years, historians had assumed that the Church of England simply refused out of reverence, that royal remains, once buried, were considered sacrosanct. But the 2024 review revealed something more nuanced and more political. The decision not to test the bones, it turns out, isn't just about sacred burial, it's about precedent. If the Abbey were to allow DNA testing on these remains, it would set a legal and ecclesiastical precedent that could be applied to all royal burials within its walls, including those of monarchs, consorts, and saints. The floodgates would open. Every contested identity, from Plantagenet to Tudor to Stuart, could suddenly be fair game for exhumation, and that, quite simply, is a constitutional nightmare. More troubling still is the fact that no official record exists detailing exactly who authorized the original reburial in 1674. Charles II certainly signed off, but no formal commission was ever convened, no inquest was held. There was no forensic evaluation, not even by 17th century standards. The bones were found, assumed to be the prince's, and reburied within months, an act of closure without inquiry, monarchy at its most performative. The 2024 report also documented how the bones were handled in the decades after their reburial. During the Victorian era, when curiosity peaked, the urn was briefly opened for examination in 1933 by a team led by Lawrence Tanner and Professor William Wright. They concluded, without DNA, without isotopic analysis, and based on comparative anatomy alone, that the bones could be the prince's. That phrase has haunted every conversation since. What the 2024 review ultimately revealed was not a conspiracy, but an institutional fear of what the truth might unlock. Because the bones don't just represent the princes, they represent the fragility of royal narrative. They remind us that even the most iconic moments in history, two boys disappearing in a tower, can end not with justice, but with a marble urn, a brass plate, and centuries of carefully sustained ambiguity. Calls for testing have grown louder in light of recent discoveries, particularly those linking artifacts and families to the events of 1483. But the Abbey holds the line. For now, the urn stays shut. The silence is policy. And yet, outside the Abbey walls, others are picking up the trail, because in 2023 and beyond, even the wreck of a royal ship, long buried, long blamed, has begun to yield new clues, and with it, new arguments about the nature of guilt, survival, and royal failure. The Gloucester didn't just sink, it exploded into history. Again. 24. The Gloucester Follow-Ups, 2023. The sea has a long memory. Things lost beneath it don't always stay quiet. When the wreck of the Gloucester was first publicly announced in 2022, after lying submerged off the Norfolk coast since its catastrophic sinking in 1682, it felt like a final chapter. The ship had been found. The mystery of its location was over. The bones of the story could be cleaned, catalogued, placed behind glass, and taught to students. A neat historical resolution. But as always with royal disasters, the real story only begins after the wreckage is found. In 2023, a wave of exhibitions, research outputs, and interpretative materials emerged from the Gloucester project, each one peeling back another layer of the event, reframing what we thought we knew. The ship wasn't just a piece of royal hardware, it was a floating political crisis, and its sinking has now been thoroughly recontextualized. To start, the Gloucester wasn't just transporting courtiers and sailors, it was carrying James, Duke of York, the future James II, back from political exile. At the time of the voyage, tensions in England were high. Protestant fears about Catholic succession were boiling. The Restoration had stabilized the monarchy under Charles II, but the future was far from secure. James's return was supposed to be a calculated re-entry into court life. Instead, it nearly killed him, and did kill somewhere between 130 to 250 others, including several high-ranking nobles. The new research focused on why the ship sank and who was responsible. Contemporary accounts were vague, politically cautious, or outright contradictory. Some blamed the pilot. Others whispered that the Duke's stubbornness had delayed evacuation and cost lives. The 2023 studies confirmed what many suspected. The Gloucester ran aground on a known sandbank after ignoring multiple navigational warnings. Surviving logs and reconstructed maps now suggest the ship's course deviation was due to James's insistence on proceeding against better advice. Worse, once the ship struck and began to founder, protocols for evacuation were followed too rigidly. The Duke reportedly refused to abandon ship until the formal lowering of the royal barge was complete, a delay that doomed many. It wasn't just a nautical accident, it was a failure of hierarchy under pressure, the rigid observance of ceremony over common sense, and in that sense, the wreck stands not just as a relic of maritime misfortune, but as a case study in the perils of royal deference. The exhibitions built on this, offering multi-perspective narratives, audio recordings of imagined testimonies, 3D models of the ship's layout, recovered artifacts like navigational instruments, leather shoes, wine bottles, and personal items from the crew. The most jarring exhibit featured a simulation of the timeline, how quickly the ship listed and how little time lower-ranking passengers had to escape. There were even discussions of class in survival statistics. Of the elite, many escaped. Of the crew and minor passengers, most perished. The wreck has become a symbol of how privilege floats while others drown. And in a deeper sense, the Gloucester's story speaks to the fragility of power. James survived, but his reign, when it came, would be short and catastrophic. He was deposed in the Glorious Revolution just a few years later, remembered less for leadership and more for fleeing the country with the crown still on his head. The Gloucester, in hindsight, was an omen, a disaster ignored, a warning unheeded, but it wasn't the only Tudor or Stuart-era structure to vanish quietly beneath the modern world. In 2023, another royal space, this time one built not to sail, but to impress, surfaced again in scholarship and soil. It was Whitehall Palace, once the grandest palace in Europe, and now little more than memory, until fresh archaeology started telling a different story. 25. Whitehall Palace Archaeology Update 2023. There was a time when Whitehall Palace was the beating heart of royal England. Stretching along the north bank of the Thames from Charing Cross to Westminster, it was not merely a palace, it was a city in miniature, an imperial statement in brick and plaster. In its 16th and 17th century heyday, it was the largest palace in Europe, boasting over 1,500 rooms, a bowling green, a tennis court, and the famous banqueting house designed by Inigo Jones. And yet today, it's gone. Vanished into roads, office buildings, and the bureaucratic sprawl of central London. All that remains above ground is the banqueting house itself, white, symmetrical, slightly adrift on the modern avenue, like a surviving tooth from a long-buried jaw. The rest of the palace was destroyed in a series of fires between 1691 and 1698, and over the centuries, London simply built over it. But palaces, especially ones this grand, never truly disappear. They just sink into the ground, into records, into assumptions. And in 2023, a fresh wave of archaeological research, spearheaded by Historic Royal Palaces, in collaboration with the Museum of London Archaeology, began to stitch the threads back together. It wasn't a single excavation that did it. Instead, the update came through a combination of archival reanalysis, ground-penetrating radar, and limited test trenches conducted during routine infrastructure works in and around Whitehall and Horse Guards Road. What they found was not revolutionary, but it was revelatory. Beneath the Treasury's car park and surrounding government offices, researchers confirmed subsurface foundations of the palace's lost service buildings. Kitchens, stables, and parts of the privy lodgings once used by Henry VIII and his successors. In particular, the outlines of a tiled gallery, likely part of the Queen's lodgings, matched descriptions from Elizabethan inventories. Even more intriguing were fragments of decorative plasterwork retrieved from spoil heaps and matched to fire-damaged debris layers. Some bore the same Tudor rose and fleur-de-lis motifs found in surviving royal residences. One frieze fragment, still faintly gilded, may have once adorned the ceiling of the Great Watching Chamber, a room where ambassadors were received and rivals were measured. But the real breakthrough was interpretative. Using newly digitized 17th century floor plans, researchers were able to superimpose the full original palace layout onto the modern cityscape. It was like laying a ghost city across a living one. Suddenly, what had felt like anonymous streets and bland government facades became haunted spaces, corridors that once hosted coronation banquets, statecraft, and private betrayals. It reframed London itself, not just as a city with history, but a city made of history. The updated archaeology has already influenced public history initiatives. A new augmented reality walking tour allows visitors to see Whitehall Palace reconstructed through their phones as they walk through the streets that now cover it. Plans are underway for embedded street plaques marking the lost rooms and courtyards, but perhaps the most evocative moment in the 2023 report was the recovered section of red Tudor brick, warped and blackened by heat, likely from the 1698 fire that finally ended the palace's reign. Found just a few inches below modern pavement, it's a strange relic, a royal wall reduced to rubble, resting beneath a bus stop. Whitehall's vanishing act reminds us that royal spaces are never really gone. They're just overwritten by bureaucracy, by infrastructure, by forgetfulness. And with that last buried fragment, we return to where we began. Not with an answer, but with a question. If the symbols of royal power, thrones, bones, ships, palaces, can be lost, misread, moved, or mistaken, what exactly is it we think endures? Maybe the mystery isn't what happened to these places. Maybe the real mystery is why we keep looking.